Hello everyone. Mohammed Hassan never imagined that a simple invitation could change his life forever. He was a young man who grew up in a devout Muslim family in a peaceful small town. Since childhood, he was known as an intelligent, well-informed individual who was always a role model for his friends. However, Hassan was also known for his very open nature, curiosity, and his willingness to talk about religion and beliefs. Hassan's life went on peacefully until one day, his friend Amir approached him with an invitation he couldn't refuse. Amir, who had once been in class with him, was now working at a social institution said to focus on interfaith education. Hassan, I know you are an open-minded and rational person. I'm sure you can gain a lot from the religious discussion event we are hosting. It's not just an ordinary lecture, it's an opportunity to see different religious perspectives, said Amir persuasively. Hassan, who always wanted to broaden his horizons, agreed to attend the event, though he felt a little suspicious about Amir's enthusiasm. However, he dismissed the doubt. How could a religious discussion event be dangerous? Isn't it an opportunity to engage in dialogue and learn? On the day of the event, he headed to the venue. Upon arrival, the atmosphere, which initially seemed academic and open, slowly turned into something strange. The number of attendees was more than he expected, and they all seemed to be well organized. Some of them were wearing distinctive clothing, as though they had been preparing for this event long in advance. However, Hassan did not feel intimidated. He still believed that this was a valuable opportunity. In front of them, a priest stood with great authority. The priest wore a long robe and began with words so convincing, as if he had the answers to every big question in life. Religion is about understanding the true truth. The truth that lies beyond the confines of doctrines that often bind us, said the priest confidently. At that moment, Hassan started to feel the tension in the air. Something was off. The discussion, which initially seemed like an intellectual forum, now felt increasingly political and uncomfortable. In the midst of the priest's presentation, Hassan began to hear whispers among the other participants. Some of them looked at him with unusual stares. For a moment, he felt as though he were on stage, trapped in a game far larger than he had realized. Before he could ask any questions, a man sitting near him with a mysterious smile handed him a small book. "Read this, and you will know everything," he said. Hassan, who was beginning to feel uneasy, quickly opened the first page. It was a book that claimed to explain a higher truth of religion, but its explanation felt strange and inconsistent with what he knew about Islam. Suddenly, the atmosphere shifted. The priest, who had seemed so wise, now spoke in a more urgent tone. "We invited you not just to discuss. We want you to demonstrate your commitment to the search for truth by following this ritual." He showed a symbol that Hassan recognized as part of a very different religion. Hassan was stunned. He felt cornered, but didn't know what to do. The people around him started to stare at him, some with hopeful expressions, others with smiles that made his blood boil. Hassan sensed that something dark was lurking. At that moment, Amir approached and patted his shoulder. "This is not just a discussion, Hassan. We need your commitment to follow this path, to truly find the truth." Hassan, now feeling trapped, tried to maintain his calm. "I can't follow this. This is not the truth I'm looking for," he answered firmly, even though his heart was pounding. But it seemed they had already prepared everything. Unexpectedly, two people dressed similarly to the priest approached and grabbed his arm. "We can't let you go, Hassan. This choice is part of your destiny." At that moment, Hassan felt as if the entire world was closing in on him. He was escorted out of the room, and at that very moment, his peaceful life turned into a nightmare. He was dragged into a back room and accused of improper conduct. His courage to refuse was now twisted into lies that trapped him. Amir, no longer looking like the friend he once knew, could only stare at him with empty eyes. "I'm sorry, Hassan. This is bigger than you think." Soon after, Hassan was taken to the police station on charges of inciting unrest and insulting another religion. Though he tried to explain that he had only attended as a participant, the accusation had already been made and quickly spread. And unable to resist, he was eventually thrown into prison. However, even though he was far from freedom, something inside him told him that this was not the end, but rather the beginning of a much bigger journey. The first days in prison for Hassan felt like an endless nightmare. The cold, gloomy prison walls, the pungent smells, and the screams from other inmates made him feel trapped in darkness. However, even though his body was confined, his heart remained full of hope. Hassan knew that he had to stay strong, because he believed that Allah was always with his patient and trusting servants. The prison was filled with all kinds of people. Some were trapped in the world of drugs, some were involved in organized crime, and most were members of notorious, brutal gangs. On the first day, Hassan met various types of people, and they all seemed tough and indifferent to each other. The atmosphere inside the prison was certainly not friendly to a young man like Hassan, especially when he knew that many of them lived in violence and hatred. However, Hassan didn't come to escape. In fact, he felt that this was a great trial he had to face. He knew that the path of dawah, Islamic preaching, was not always easy, even in an environment as harsh as prison. With firm determination, he began to approach the other inmates. Hassan spoke to them gently, asking about their lives, and slowly started building relationships. At first, the inmates responded cynically and dismissively. They felt that a young man like Hassan wouldn't last long in their world. In fact, some of them even mocked him. "You want to be an imam here? This is prison, not a mosque," said a large man, covered in tattoos and with a rough face. However, Hassan was undeterred. He knew that they were trapped in a world full of anger and hatred. He didn't give up, even though many mocked him. He continued trying, speaking calmly, offering advice on inner peace and faith that could change lives. One night, after trying for a long time, an inmate finally approached him. His name was Joko, a man known for his toughness and as a member of one of the largest gangs in prison. Joko was often involved in fights and was seen as someone not to be trifled with. But one night, after seeing Hassan sitting in the corner of his cell reading the Quran, he approached. "Why aren't you afraid?" asked Joko, his voice softer than usual. Hassan looked at him and smiled. "Why should I be afraid? If we trust in Allah, there is nothing to fear." Joko paused for a moment. "I've done many bad things, Hassan. I don't know if Allah would still listen to my prayers." Hassan looked at Joko with understanding. "Allah always listens, Joko. There is nothing too big to be forgiven. What matters is that we try to change, no matter what our past is." Joko fell silent. He felt that there was something different about Hassan, something he couldn't find in the harsh world he had been living in. From that moment on, Joko began to approach Hassan more often, listening to the small sermons he gave, and even started studying the Quran that Hassan lent him. However, the path of dawah in prison was not as easy as it seemed. After a few weeks, Hassan realized that there were many obstacles he had to face, especially from the prison authorities who preferred chaos and violence. They didn't like the ideas Hassan brought, especially because more and more inmates were becoming interested in Islamic preaching. One of the prison authorities, known as Bang Wawan, saw Hassan as a threat. "Don't think you can turn this prison into a peaceful place," said Bang Wawan in a threatening tone when he met Hassan. "Here violence rules. Don't talk too much about religion." However, despite the threats from powerful people, Hassan remained firm. He knew that even though he was under the control of people like Bang Wawan, he was never truly alone. Every time he felt cornered, he would remember the words of Prophet Muhammad SAW. "Indeed, Allah is with those who are patient, The greatest challenge came one night when a group of inmates from a large prison gang decided to test Hassan. They invited him to the isolation room, where there were no guards. There, they challenged Hassan to fight. "You said you could change us, right? Prove it," one of them yelled. Hassan, though physically smaller and weaker than them, didn't feel intimidated. He knew this wasn't the time to fight with violence. Calmly, he said, "Islam teaches us to protect each other and avoid violence. There is no victory in fighting, only defeat." The inmates fell silent, some starting to doubt. They couldn't understand why Hassan was so calm and unafraid. They sensed that there was another strength flowing within him. One of them, named Dedi, finally said, "You're right. Maybe we do need something more than just violence." That turning point made Hassan even more convinced that his preaching was not in vain. Even in the darkest situations, Islam could bring light. The days in prison grew harder, but Hassan felt that every step he took brought him closer to a greater purpose. More and more inmates approached him, drawn to his words full of wisdom and calmness. However, even though his heart was content seeing the small changes around him, the greatest challenge had yet to come. It came when the leader of the largest gang in the prison, Rico, started to take notice of him. Rico was a figure known by everyone in prison. He stood nearly 2 meters tall, his body covered in dark tattoos, and his eyes always sharp, staring at the world with a hardened demeanor. He was the leader of the gang that controlled most of the illegal activities in the prison. On the outside, Rico was feared, and inside he ruled with an iron fist. No one dared to challenge him. At first, Rico observed Hassan from a distance. However, as more gang members began to join the congregational prayers that Hassan organized, Rico began to feel threatened. He could not let this continue. Someone like Hassan, who brought peace and taught calmness, could change the entire order he had long controlled. One night, after the Isya prayer, Rico approached Hassan with heavy steps. His eyes were sharp, and his sneering smile showed that he had already made up his mind about something. "You want to change this world, huh?" Rico said in a low voice. "But here there's only one rule. The strong rule." Hassan looked at him calmly. "No, Rico. Here, it's not physical strength that rules, but the strength of the heart. Islam teaches us to love each other, to overcome hatred with love." Rico chuckled, as if Hassan had just said the most foolish thing he'd ever heard. "You think this nonsense can defeat us? We've sunk too deep into this world. We don't need love, we need power." Hassan didn't back down. Power can conquer the body, but it cannot conquer the soul. If we all change, no one can resist the goodness that comes from a pure heart. Rico stared at Hassan for a long time, as though weighing something in his mind. Then, suddenly, he said, "I want to see for myself if your nonsense can bring about change in a place like this." Rico didn't just threaten, he also tested. He gave Hassan a challenge. He would gather all the gang members and decide if Hassan could speak to them without anyone opposing or belittling him. Hassan knew this was the greatest test of his life, but he wasn't afraid. With prayer in his heart, he accepted the challenge. The next day, hundreds of inmates from various gangs gathered in the open yard. Rico stood at the front, watching with sharp eyes, while Hassan stood alone in front of them all. Some of them began to snort, some laughed, and others challenged him with scornful looks. Hassan began with a soft voice, but one full of conviction. "My brothers, I'm not here to teach you what is right or wrong. I just want to talk about how we can find peace within ourselves. Each of us has a dark past, but that doesn't have to define our future. Islam teaches that no one is beyond change. No one is without a second chance." The atmosphere grew tense. Some of them began to speak, exchanging glances. Hassan could feel the tension, but he continued. "We are all trapped in a world of violence and hatred. But if we are willing to accept that there is another way, a way filled with forgiveness, then we can begin to free ourselves from those chains. I'm not asking you to be perfect, only to try to be better." At that moment, something unexpected happened. One of the biggest gang members, Dedi, who had always been tough and never showed any weakness, lowered his head. Slowly, he walked forward and stood beside Hassan. "I want to try," he said in a deep but clear voice. Dedi's decision became a turning point for the other inmates. Slowly, one by one, they began to gather. Some even sat down, listening seriously, while others still looked hesitant. But there was a noticeable change. Something within them started to stir. Rico, who had initially looked on with cynicism, began to feel a wave of change that he couldn't suppress. He stood in the middle of the crowd, silent, without speaking, his eyes focused on Hassan, who spoke with full conviction. Several hours later, without anyone opposing or interrupting, the majority of the gang members began to follow Hassan in prayer. It was a deeply emotional moment. Rico, who had been harsh and invincible, felt something different. He began to realize that perhaps, within Islam, he could find the peace he had been searching for all along. At the end of that day, Rico approached Hassan and said, "I don't know how this happened, but you're right. There's something in your words that made me rethink my life." And with that, Rico, the undefeated gang leader, finally recited the Shahada, the Islamic declaration of faith, in front of Hassan. Other gang members followed him one by one. Although it was only a small step, the change that occurred was extraordinary. Hassan, who had once been trapped and imprisoned, now saw his dawah flourishing in the most unexpected place. In the darkness of the prison, he had ignited a light of guidance that not only touched the hearts of the gangsters, but also changed the entire atmosphere of the prison. Hassan knew his struggle wasn't over, but he no longer felt trapped. On the contrary, he felt freer than ever, because he knew that Allah was always with those who strive to seek his path.